like the third time in 5 minutes. Dropping stuff like a pregnant lady. That one might get me in trouble later. I don't know. Anyways, we are in Titus chapter 3, because that won't get me in trouble. The intention is, this week we will finish the book of Titus. But sometimes intentions are not what reality happens. So we have a built-in stopping point, but hopefully it'll be verse 15. But Titus chapter 3, starting in verse 8. This is a trustworthy statement, and concerning these things I want you to speak confidently, so that those who have believed God will be careful to engage in good deeds. These things are good and profitable for men. But avoid foolish controversies, and genealogies, and strife, and disputes about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. Reject a factious man, after a first and a second warning, knowing that such a man is perverted and is sinning, being self-condemned. When I send Artemas or Tychicus to you, excuse me, make every effort to come to me at Nicopolis, for I have decided to spend the winter there. Diligently help Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their way, so that nothing is lacking for them. Our people must also learn to engage in good deeds to meet pressing needs, so that they will not be unfruitful. All who are with me greet you. Greet those who love us in the faith. Grace be with you all. Father God, as we look at your letter to Titus by the hand of Paul, I would just ask that you would help us to take to heart the call to be active, to be doing. That we would be a people who are zealous for good deeds. Help us to love you enough to put that into the way in which we live. Help us to be people who are more concerned about your kingdom than just winning fights. And in your name we pray. Amen. I like that this ending summarizes in a practical way the book as a whole. And we will look at that as we go. But one of the things that I really, really enjoy is that there is a practical implication for the gospel. It's one of the things I really like about the book of Titus is that you can never get away from, I know something and now I've got to do something. This is the flow of Christianity. And with Christianity has always been, if you know something, it should affect how you live. So it shouldn't be that we just sit in endless classes and classes and classes and classes. And I'm all for learning. I'm all for education. I mean, I work for a college and seminary. I'm very pro-learning, whether that's in formal settings or just, I mean, I was the kid, well, I say kid, I was the adult even. If I had encyclopedias, I would still read them just for the sake of reading encyclopedias. But they don't print them anymore. You have to go online, and anyways. But the notion is that it's not just about learning, right? There are some subject matters that I have spent way too much time just to learn about that I'm never going to do anything with it. I mean, like, it doesn't affect my life one iota. But the gospel cannot be one of those things. And this is what Paul starts with here. In verse 8, when he says, this is a trustworthy statement, what he is going back to, and there's some debate if he's looking forward or back, but remember what he just got done with was this two-part, remember what you once were. You once were, foolish, illogical, rash, and, flat out crazy kind of a thing. You did all the things that annoy you when lost people do them. But then God saved you, and this was true of you. And he gives us salvation, about how God changes at our core who we are, and about how God makes us something more than what we were. So no, hierarchy of needs, Absalom, or I think, yeah, that's his name. I kept wanting to say Absalom, and I was like, I know that's not right. That's one of David's boys. But, it's not being the best you can be. It's about being somebody totally different because God has made you a new creation. Yeah. And I, for one, am quite thankful about that. So having that in mind, having in mind that we once were one thing, but now are a different thing, person, thing, you get my point. That should drive us then to want to speak confidently. That we know there's a difference, right? I know the difference before Christ and after Christ in my life. Like, you could not convince me just on that testimony alone, and I'm sure the same is true about you, that there is no God, right? Like, my own life for me bears out, no, there's clearly a difference. This was not, I just got a good moral code and decided, there we go. Okay, because that's just not going to be the way in which this flies. But so that those who have believed God will be careful. And the word careful here is not like careful when you're moving something fragile. I about said fragile. Been watching too much Red Green. I don't know if you can, but this is where I've been. So not nearly as spiritual as some things, but man, he's good entertainment. But in I found he had a YouTube channel. I'm sorry. YouTube is a rabbit hole. Please use it responsibly. Joe will tell you if you have any questions that it is the dark rabbit hole. Is what we refer to it as. But anyways, more to the spiritual concerns. Careful is not fragility. It's not handling things. It is intentionality. It is the kind of the same as when you would tell your kids, I want you to make sure that you're careful to behave for grandma. Right? It's not that they needed to like treat grandma with kid gloves. I mean, maybe they did, but the notion is that they would be intentional about it. That's what we're talking about here, careful, on purpose, that intentionality, which is kind of how we use that word when you're moving something fragile as well, right? You tell your kids, be careful with that, and what that means is they just don't pick it up and toss it. There's a purpose in moving it. That's the same here, is that as Christians, we are called to be careful, to be intentional about doing the things of God. There is a intentionality in thinking about it. You will sometimes, oops, I did Christianity, right? Sometimes it will just happen because you are a new creation and what is inside flows outside. Sometimes you will accidentally get it right. Sometimes. Sometimes. But you will get it right a lot more often if you will go, I need to get it right. And there is a purpose in, right? There are certain people that we want to lay hands on, right? Okay, maybe it's just me, I don't know. But I doubt it, because I've heard some of your stories. Right? And there are those people who you know I could yell at, and everybody else in the office would be totally fine if I gave them the what for. Or the what for. Sorry, I'll use English. Right? There's this moment in which you have to go, but the good work is. The more Christ-like thing is just to throw his desk around. Because as we know, when Jesus goes into the temple, okay, bad use of the story. But there is an intentionality that we have to live with. There is an intentionality that we have to grab the impulse to throttle people and go, no, that's not right. There is an impulse control of, I could get away with this. But that's not how this works. No. There is an impulse of, I will tell you one thing and do another, but that's not the way this works. I have to be careful. I have to be intentional. And not just about the things which are out there, but the things in which I choose to do. Not the omissions, but the commissions. If I really want to affect the kingdom, I have to think through, well, if I'm going to minister to lost people, if I'm going to give lost people the gospel, I've got to know some lost people. Which takes intentionality for a guy who works at a seminary, works at a church, lives in a Christian home. I'm not complaining about any of these things, but for me to have lost people in my lives is not the same as I go to Monday. It used to be. There were a couple lost people that have worked for the seminary, and it's weird. I'm not quite sure how they pass muster, but that's a whole different ballgame. But for the most part, I have to be intentional about finding lost people to commune with. And this may be true for you. But we have to be intentional about even thinking if I use my money for this, then I can't use it for this. If I do this with my time, then I don't have the time needed for kingdom things. So all of these things are in play. And this is what Paul is saying about be careful, be intentional. Think through how you're going to do kingdom work. Because if you're just waiting for God to go, oh, this is it right here, you're going to be waiting a while. Most of ministry happens when we're just doing life. Most of your real impact is going to be just life. And we'll illustrate it this way. Think about all the times you had with grandma, right? And all of those times, it wasn't that, the big moments, right? Most of those times, it's not we went to Disneyland, but it's we made cookies in the kitchen. I about said in the living room, and that made no sense. We sat by and we did, we knitted in the living room. I never knitted with my grandmother, but I'm trying to, I was the cookies in the kitchen guy. Or whatever it is, but it's those everyday moments that really connect with people. And that is really where the heft of the gospel is done as well. It's the people that you see often in the small and in the everyday. You just don't get up and go run a marathon, especially if you're sane. It's just not, but you've got to train for it. You've got to go. Like there's an app, Couch to 5K, for a reason. Okay? And I know it exists. It's a good app. And if you're looking to go run a marathon, there you go. But the evil run when nobody chases them. Just keep that in mind. But the notion here, it's a Bible verse. It's in Proverbs. I'm still anti-running. It's just, I've got to be highly motivated. But Paul here is very anti-running for Christ. Or he's very pro-running for Christ. I did that totally backwards. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to bring myself back from the squirrel driving the bus. But the notion is that we would diligently be on purpose for doing the good works. And good works being defined as those things which are advancing the kingdom. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, there are people who are intentionally not doing good works. Right? That's verse 9. But avoid foolish controversies. Now these are those doctrines that everybody kind of goes, what are we talking about? Right? And the first century world had a lot of these, but we don't know exactly which one. I'm sure Paul has some in mind, because as soon as I said that, you all went, I know that one. And this is just that thing of, is it proper to wear your hair bobbed, or does it have to be up in a ponytail? Or, like these sorts of things in which we kind of go, and in the long run, this affects what? But there were, like what color's the carpet? What color do we paint the front door? I don't know. It doesn't matter. Find a Bible verse for one of those and we'll care. But the notion is that we would just steer away from those people and those things which are just about, I just want to have a good fight. And we're going to see that as we go on. But also in genealogies, which for us is a weird thing because we kind of go, what? But in the first century world, there are two ways in which this plays out. If he's talking to a primarily Jewish audience, then the longer you could trace your Jewishness back, and you could show that you were a Jew the furthest, then you win. You are the most spiritual by default, because you're the most pure. And Paul, in another one of his letters, says, I am a Hebrew of the Hebrews. Well, that means he can trace his generations back so far on both mother and father side. Like it's a technical phrase, and it's weird to us because we're like, well, who cares? But in some ways, this is also, you get the guys who are like, well, my daddy was a pastor, and my granddaddy was a pastor, and my great-grandpappy was a pastor, and you just kind of go, but clearly that calling is not yours. Or sometimes it is. Hey, I'm all for family legacies if that's the case. But, we look and sometimes it's like, well, I come from great stock, so you should listen. And sometimes I wonder if like sons and grandsons of pastors or famous evangelists, maybe you should go back and listen to whoever's stuff a little bit more. It's odd like that, and it happens. But sometimes genealogies are about, because remember, this is the Isle of Crete that we're talking about, and they would take every advantage. And sometimes if this is a more secular culture versus a pocket of Judaism, and it's hard to tell which, then it's but I come from royal stock, right? If you ever talk to a Virginian, and you're hearing one now, every true Virginian is related to George Washington. It's a thing. I don't know how, because if you look at the number of kids he had, the math does not work. And I've yet to figure out, but every true Virginian, every diehard, somehow makes it back to good old George, right? And somehow this makes us better Virginians, right? And there's this sense of pride in, I come from George Washington, which, let us make no mistake, I come from George Washington. I'm cool. Okay, so that last statement is, yeah, maybe. But the notion is that there is this certain bit of entitlement that sometimes comes when you start figuring out, oh, I come from royalty. Well, that's nice, but you don't live in no castle, right? And you can clearly tell I come from royalty. I can't even talk right. But there's this notion of, I don't care what your ancestors were, you're digging the ditch alongside the rest of us. Congratulations. But it's that kind of notion, and either one of those could be the case. But then the point overall is that, arguing about, well, I come from, so I'm better. No. The ground is pretty equal at the foot of the cross. Last time I checked, you were depraved, I was depraved, and Jesus rescued us both. Amen. And that's the glory of the gospel, is that there's no room for, well, this is where I come from, so I got a leg up. Right? If anybody were to get a leg up, if you knew my grandmother, you would know I already have a leg up. I win. But it doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter if your parents 40 generations ago, all the way straight, unbroken, were saved. You still got to get to the cross the same way. So the other part of this is, and strife, meaning just picking fights, and disputes about the law. Now the law is very important. And I even say that being on this side of the cross, right? We live under grace, not the law, but the law teaches us who Christ is. So the law is still important, even if we're not living under it. This is why we, on Sunday night, study the Old Testament as well. But the notion here is that in Paul's day, they would argue about how the law does or doesn't carry over. How does that shadow fit over here and what we see now clearly under the spotlight of Christ? And there's a lot of this of how that goes about. But also know that Paul is fighting against a group called the Judaizers, who were very adamant that, okay, great, you got saved by grace, but you know how you keep that, right? You keep that by being a good Jew. Yeah, you got saved so you could be a good Jew. And they got very adamant about the things of the law. And this was not unheard of even in the Jewish community itself, where they would argue about, well, it kind of means that, well, no, I think it actually means this. And it's the notion of, Jesus, for instance, gets asked the question of divorce. Well, is it for anything or just for infidelity? Well, that's a raging debate in the first century Jewish world. And Jesus, answers it very masterfully. And it's just all of these things that come up of, well, do I still have to cut my hair a certain way? Can I mix my clothing? And you would have people who would debate that back and forth. One of the things that happens early on in the first century church is they have to have what's called the Jerusalem Council. Because all of these Gentiles have now got saved. And they're clearly Gentiles. And then the Jews are like, well, we're glad that that's happening, but how does the gospel and Judaism... So they get together. And they pray through it, and they work through it, and they, come down on, okay, well, these things are essentials, and you got to keep those. But these other things, you don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to keep our dietary laws, except don't strangle your food and don't drink blood. As long as you stay away from those, you're okay. And it's that sort of mentality. This is what he's getting at. They would argue ad nauseum about silly things. I am so glad that we are way past this as a church. Some of the discussions that we like to argue about in seminary, and I get to be wonderfully a part of some of them, you just look at, and my favorite way to decide if I'm going to get involved in this is to ask the people arguing, okay, so if you're right, what does this ultimately change about how we live? And I'll ask both of them, and if one of them or both of them give me a good answer, then I'll engage in the argument. But I'm too old otherwise now. I'm just tired. By the time when lunch rolls around, I just want to eat my food and space for a little bit. That's not always been the case. I'm not sure if that's maturity or tiredness. It could go either way. But this is what he's telling us to avoid. And why should we avoid them? Because they're unprofitable and worthless. Amen. If the notion is that we just want to have an argument, which is the outcropping, verse 10, reject a factitious man, somebody who just wants to have a good argument. And there are plenty of people in our churches who just want to have a good argument for the sake of, I just want to be right. And they will die hard to be right. These are the people that we're to avoid. Right? I sat under a pastor once who really enjoyed a good fight. Like, I think it was his pastime. And now he was a good preacher. He knew his Bible well. I mean, to cast no disparagons on that, but he would find things just to, like, you sitting around the table and he'd like start picking at it. And I was like, okay. At first I thought, okay, we're all young seminary pups, and you're the elder, and you're helping us think through things. Cool. But then I noticed, like, he just did it all the time with everybody. And then he would tell me stories about, yeah, I once argued with the church about getting the lights changed, and when I won, I just went in the sanctuary and sat under the lights. And I was like, you're a weirdo. And needless to say, like, I stopped hanging out with him as much at that point. But the notion is that there are some people who just like to have a good fight. I don't understand those people. Because again, I'm either more mature than I was or I'm tired. I don't know. But I don't have time let's just have a good fight. But there are those people who are in churches that are looking to have a good fight. And it's a superiority thing. They clearly, I have an example in my head. I won't use it. Because there are certain boundaries I got to be careful with. And sometimes this one particular thing shouldn't nullify. Anyway, it's not important. What is important is that we have to be careful that we're not arguing about doctrine just to argue. Now, if the doctrine is going to get us somewhere, or it's an essential doctrine, like if you want to tell me that God is a woman, we're going to argue about that. I promise you, we're going to argue about that one. But there are certain things that I'm just going to, well, okay, I don't agree with that, but, you know, and certain of those things are always eschatology. That's the one we really love, but I'm going to avoid those. But there are those people who like to argue just simply so that they can show you that they're smarter than everybody else. That they're more learned than everybody else. And it's about, if I can argue this point and then other people argue my point for me, then I've arrived, right? Then I'm a bigwig. I have a name if you're going to repeat my arguments down the line. Avoid those people. Now again, if it's for the sake of actual doctrine, or if it's for the sake of growth, and we see, well, if we change the way you think about this, then you'll be more Christ-like in how you live your life. Great, let's talk about that. But a fight for the sake of a fight is worthless. It is of the devil. Christ does not argue with people just to argue with people when he's alive, right? And by that I mean walking the earth, the 3.5 years of his ministry. You know, he doesn't just engage in debates for the sake of debates. He actually walks away from several of them. But instead, or he'll rephrase the question to get somewhere else. Right? That's the way this is supposed to look. Fighting for the sake of fighting is what a dog does. Right? If a dog wants to establish his territory, he fights the other dog. Don't be a dog. There you go. But the notion is that we would seek out the godly things that are about bringing together. Not ignoring essential doctrines, but in the sense of there are those people who are intentionally dividing so that you don't have momentum. Because if we're so busy fighting each other, who are we not fighting? The lost world. And we're not bringing them in because we're still trying to figure out which one of us is in. That is one of the things that will always cripple churches. Now, there are certain things that you cannot bend on. Please don't bend on those essentials. But certain other things, like I don't care if you're a premillennialist, an amillennialist, a postmillennialist, somewhere in between millennials, whatever. Like, we're probably not going to have long, drawn-out arguments on this. Partially because I'm not sure what a millennialist I am yet. I'm still figuring that one out. It's part of why we haven't swam in the book of Revelation yet. Because I might drown. No, I'm just, well, okay, maybe a little. But the notion is that a good fight for the sake of a good fight is never a good fight. And we have to be careful of those. And if we find those people in our midst, we're to set them to the side. We're to essentially say, okay, we're not going to just entertain fighting for the sake of fighting. That is what he means by, after a first and second warning, knowing that such a man is perverted, bent, and is sinning, being self-condemned. He shows himself to be what he is. If we are still trying to look at me, I know stuff in our arguments, then we show that we don't actually know who Christ is. Because if I know who Christ is, then I'm not trying to get people to me. I'm not winning you to my kingdom, because my kingdom is what it is. You want to be a part of God's kingdom. And that's what I want you to be a part of. And that is the notion that Paul was getting at with Titus here, is that as you watch, people who want to be in the spotlight are already showing you that they don't know Christ as well as they do. Now, they may be able to talk a good game, they can probably argue real well, but at the end of the day, they don't know Christ very well. And then he moves on in verse 12 in kind of a personal yet not as personal as it may seem. When I send, and at the time of the letter, he doesn't know if he's sending Artemas or Tychicus. It could go either way. It's somebody who is coming later on down the road, and we don't know much about either one of these people, by the way. We know some. You can find them kind of scattered. They're kind of here and there, but they're not a major character in any of the stories from Acts or mentioned in another letter. But what we do see is that these are, again, faithful men who are coming to carry on. And the notion is that Titus has a limited amount of time. And that's another reason why we need to be diligent about doing the good works. You have a limited amount of time. You only have so many days to live. Christ himself says, for it is appointed unto man once to die and then the judgment. He knows how long you're going to live. Even as a young person, you only have so many days to live. You only have so much time to do the good. There's going to come a point in which it's hard to do that good, right? I'm fairly mobile. But as I look at my father, and I don't mean this in any way disparagingly, I love my dad to death, but I also see that's my genetics right there. As I look at that and I realize he can't feel his feet. It's hard for him to walk. It's getting harder for him to do kingdom work. He used to be very active in church, and he's not as active now just simply because it's hard to get up and going, right? And we could use other examples of this, and we get it. There is a time in which we have the ability to get up and get going. So the point here is that while we can, we should. Because no matter how much I may want to retire from this pulpit, that may or may not happen. Maybe I will go to Uganda. Not quite on the radar yet, but God's weird. I was going to do youth ministry till I died. Didn't quite work out that way. Yeah. I'm sure y'all are young at heart. I'm totally getting there. But I was also going to be a park ranger, and none of y'all look like trees. God does what God wants to do. But here, we have to be cognizant there's a time. And time can be very motivating, right? Those of you who are doing schoolwork, you know, oh, I've got to have it turned in by a certain time. It's motivating to get it done for most people. There's always that one kid who's like, I know that I can finagle an extension, it's fine. And then I was always really mad at those kids because I never was that kid. I always did it on time and I get really angry. Anyway, it's not important. I'm maturing. I'm getting past my anger issues because of Christ. But Amen. Here, there is I want you to come meet me in this city. And I'm going to winter there. Paul's not there yet. He hasn't gotten there yet, but he's going. And the notion is look, your time is limited. Do what you can, and then hand off. Diligently help Zenas the lawyer and Apollos. There is almost next to nothing for Zenas as far as who he is. We know that he's a lawyer, and most likely that means that he is in the sense of like a Jewish lawyer, a knower of the law, being the Torah. But it may be, given that his name doesn't really match Judaism very much, it may be that he is a lawyer in the sense of arguing in front of magistrates as well. But in either course, these two guys are very missionary type people. And the notion is that these two are a practical example of how you live out being zealous for good works. Right? These are two traveling missionaries. Apollos had been saved, but he had only known part of the gospel. Aquila and Priscilla take him to the side to explain the full gospel. And he is this really eloquent speaker. This is what we know of Apollos. He is a great speaker. He is like the guy that would pack out, the tent revivals, that kind of thing. He is described as being a very eloquent man. He's trained in rhetoric. So as a speaker, these two are going around, and they've come to Paul. They are likely the ones who have delivered the letter to Titus from Paul. So they are likely the letter carriers. And as they hand it over, and Titus goes, yep, I've been reading through this letter about how good works is something that we should be a part of. Here's a tangible example of a way in which I can show good works, right? I can partner with those who are doing gospel. There is always an opportunity for us to do good works somewhere, right? I get really tired of those who are like, well, I really want to make sure it matters what I do for the kingdom, and I'm gonna pray for years that God will give me a way to be impactful. And they miss thousands of opportunities because we're waiting for God to give us some, great task of go to Uganda. If He called you to go to Uganda, you couldn't go. You're unprepared. Do the little things, right? If you apply to go with the IMB, and I like this about the IMB, their first question, or one of their early questions, is going to be, so tell me about how you do evangelism here. Right? Because if you're not going to do evangelism with people who speak the same language as you, eat the same food as you, and shop at the same places as you, why are you going to do it across the pond somewhere? Right? Where you have to learn the language, learn the customs, and eat things that come out of the head. Right? I mean, it's just, you're just not going to be very motivated. Like, you're not going to be more motivated there than you are here. There's a certain romanticism that says, oh, yes, the switch would flip and I'd just go. That's not true. And it is also not true that just one day you wake up and God will go, okay, I know that you haven't trained for this marathon at all, but now it's time to go run a marathon. I know that you have not lifted a single weight, but now, today is the powerlifting competition. Lift the 1,000 pounds off the ground in a squat. Not happening, right? I'm not deadlifting 1,000 pounds up off the... I'm not even sure I'm going to get 50. Okay, I could probably get 50 up. But, 500, I'll be lucky. occasionally we'll pick each, never mind, we'll throw each other around at work. It's good sport. It's not out of anger. It's just, I work with young people. Love their hearts. But in the process, it's just not going to happen. You've got to train for these things. And that's what life is. Life is a series of training events in which we decide incrementally to get stronger in our Christianity. So as we look for those things, look for those big opportunities. If you can run a marathon for Jesus, and I'm not necessarily talking about a marathon in that sense, though if you can run a marathon, by all means, run a marathon with my blessing. I will cheer for you as you run. But do those things. But for some of us, where we are in life is also I'm going to go walk a half a yard for Jesus. That's fine. You walk a half a yard. Eventually, you're going to get to a yard. And eventually, it's the same as training for the marathon or the deadlift. You got to start somewhere. And Christ expects you to be responsible with what He's given you, which may be small for you. But who's the guy who saved Billy Graham? I don't know. I don't know that anybody knows. I mean, I'm sure God knows, but you don't know where those impacts go. I'm sure that the people who taught me in Sunday school, I'm sure Sue Osborne had no clue that one day all the things that she poured into me were going to end up in Missouri. I'm sure she had no clue. I'm sure Ben Jay, love his heart, old guy that he was, first got me serving in church. Love the guy to death. I'm sure he had no clue what kind of end game that was going to produce. But it was this is what we do. Let's do it. Amen. It's the small steps with people. And eventually, when you get enough of little streams running, it turns into a creek. Enough creeks turn into a river. Enough river, you can flood the world. Some of y'all live near a river, you know what I'm getting at. But the notion is that you have something you can be doing. And if you don't, God will give you something, right? Titus has plenty of things that he can do to advance the gospel. It is a target-rich environment for him. There is I looked it up even, but I didn't write it down, so I forgot his name. But there is a general who was told, look, we have you surrounded, give up. He goes, you may have me surrounded, but I prefer to think of it as a target-rich environment in which I can shoot in any direction and get you. He was probably a little on the crazy side. But they won because they were in a target-rich environment. And this is what we're getting at is this notion of do good works. The opportunity is there. The time is limited. And there are people who are going to actively be trying to get the world to go the other way. You've got to counteract it. And we counteract evil not with better evil, but with good. The kingdom is what beats the kingdom of the devil. It is the kingdom of heaven that has to win out. It is salvation and the gospel that changes who people are. And then he leans it back to this way. Verse 14. Our people. It's not Paul's people. It's not Titus's people. It's our people in the sense of those who belong to God. Must also learn to engage in good deeds to meet pressing needs. This is, again, in reference to sending out these missionaries so that they would have food and money that they needed, so that they will not be unfruitful. And it's not so that Apollos and Zenos won't be unfruitful, but so that we ourselves won't be unfruitful. So that we as Christians will continue to grow in the small things. If you were to plant grapes in your backyard, which I think would be pretty cool, but I'm a horticulturalist, so go figure. But if you were to plant grape, it is the small things that will actually keep them from producing. I mean, yeah, okay, if you have a drought, that's a problem. But most of the time, it's the little small bugs that eat out the stems. And it's the little small things that cause a big deal in plants. It's the same thing here. Do the little things. Be faithful in the little things, because those are actually the things. Most of us will not ever have the opportunity to do those things that, like we would expect to be written about in history books. Like, It's just not how that works. But if we're faithful in the small things, then it adds up to the events that do make it into the books. And the notion here is that as a pastor, or Titus as a pastor, would show, my life is on display. And then people would watch and go, oh, that's what it looks like. Right? And while I could say, look at how I live, and imitate that, the truth of the matter that we need to also be aware of is, there are people who are watching everything you do. Because you're the Jesus person. You're the one in their life who knows who God is. So when somebody says, well, are Christians charitable? They go, hold on, let me think of, and they pull up your face and go, well, yeah. Or they go, I don't know about that. You know, and that's just how that works. You're the only Bible some people are reading. It's a preacherism, but it's right. But also, all who are with me greet you. It is a reminder that he's not in it alone. Because sometimes we, like Titus, have this feeling of, I'm the only prophet left. Everybody else has bowed the knee. Oh, woe is me. Oh, the indignity. I think that was a little bit of a cartoon. It's the Old Testament, sorry. You know, but Elijah the prophet, you know, he gets the whole, oh, woe is, I'm the only one. And God goes, I still got some. Just get up, Mopey. Come on, Lord. But the notion is that, you know, we're together. There are other people who have not bowed the knee to Baal. There are other people who are still just as in love with Jesus as you are. And those people greet you. And that is sometimes the great encouragement that somebody needs, is just to be reminded, oh yeah, I'm not in this alone. Why are on the Fox 4 News, they have every Friday, tell me something good. You know why they do that? So that you'll be encouraged. I'm sure it also is good ratings for them, but it's so that you'll be encouraged. And it's this notion of, as we listen to other people's stories about how God came in and interacted, then we're encouraged to be reminded of, oh yeah, I can keep going. I can press on a little bit further. And that's the notion that's here. And I know that this is how Paul typically always closes a letter. We love you, you love us, yay. But there is a camaraderie in that. There's a reminder in that to the people who are on the ground doing ministry. And most of you are in positions, because thankfully we talk and we know what goes on in our lives, are in positions in which you are influencing people for the gospel in different ways. Keep doing that. Keep being the example. You're not alone. Greet those who love us in the faith. Grace be with you all. May the power of the gospel always be active in your lives. And that's what I want to end on here as well as we finish up in Titus. Amen. May grace always be in your life, both for you and through you. May you always be aware of the fact that the gospel of Jesus Christ has dramatically altered who you are, and thus should alter how you behave. Yeah. But also, that means it's got to touch people. Your behavior is going to ripple out from you. Let it ripple. Be good, because that's what Christ made you. Father God, we thank you for who you are.